Waiting is an inevitable part of life. It doesn't matter if you're waiting for your coffee order, waiting for the pair of shoes you really want to come back in stock, waiting for test results, or waiting on help while making a big decision. Waiting is tough. When you're waiting, you might feel excited, but you might feel skeptical too, especially when what you've been promised gets delayed. You start to wonder when you've waited long enough. Eventually, you might even give up hope. Sometimes people of faith have to wait on God. While we wait on God, we need to remember that God has a plan. God is faithful, God is listening, and we should never give up hope because God's not given up on us. Do you ever have a hard time listening or paying attention? I know I do sometimes. And the worst is when someone comes to you because they really just need someone to talk to. And all you can think about is that English test tomorrow or next week? Or, man, I wonder if coach is going to make us run laps because of what happened in the game yesterday. Or what do you think mom's going to make for dinner tonight? I hope it's not her meatloaf. Or you're thinking about that text you got from that crush of yours and wondering what it means about your relationship status. You're so distracted and you're so far away. And usually the person who's pouring themselves out, they can tell that you're not paying attention. And it's hurtful and harmful to them because all they wanted to do was have someone in their life they could trust and be open with and listen to them. I've also been on the receiving end of that where I just need to talk about something that was going on in my life and I start pouring myself out and I realize that the person is somewhere else. They're not there mentally and emotionally. They're not listening to me. And it really hurts in those moments. There's also been times where I opened up to God about something that I was struggling with or that was really hard for me or that I was hurting about. And at the end of my prayer, I wonder, man, is God even listening to me right now? Does God care? Does he know what's going on in my life? And whether it's because you're wrestling with doubt or experiencing a tragedy or walking through some difficult circumstances, it's understandable that at some points in your life, you're going to wonder, is God really listening to me? There's someone in the Bible who asked that question a lot too, and his name is David, and he's one of the most famous figures from the Old Testament of the Bible. You've probably heard the story of David and Goliath, and it's the David from that story. But to really understand David's emotions and what's going on with his story, you kind of have to start at the beginning. So let's start with scene 1. David is chosen as king. See, when David was a young boy, the land of Israel had a different king. His name was Saul. But because of Saul's actions, he had fallen out of favor with God. So God was on the lookout for a new king, and God found a new king, David, who was a young shepherd boy. But because David was so young and small and unassuming, he was almost overlooked. But God saw him, and God chose him to be king. But Saul was still ruling as king. That brings us to scene 2, and this is one of the famous ones. David defeats Goliath. See, later on, King Saul's armies were being attacked by their enemy, the Philistines. And the Philistines had this giant who was named Goliath. And he came out and he said, hey, I will fight any one soldier in your army. And if I win, then my whole country wins. And if your person wins, then your whole country wins. And no one wanted to face Goliath, including King Saul, who was the tallest person and the biggest person in the whole country. But then David shows up. And he was up for the challenge, and he defeated Goliath. Well, that brings us to scene 3. Scene 3, Saul gets jealous of David. See, David was talented, not just on the battlefield, but also a talented musician. He was so talented that Saul would have him come in and play music. He'd play his harp for him to soothe him and to calm him down. But soon, Saul began to get jealous of David because he understood how much the people loved David and how much he was liked by everyone. Saul grew angry, and eventually he tried to kill David. He threw a spear at him and wanted to kill him. Scene 4 is a conflict between Saul and David. See, things got so bad that David eventually runs for his life. He flees because Saul was wanting to hunt him down and to kill him. And there was a few close encounters along the way, but David was able to stay safe. That brings us to scene 5, where David eventually becomes king. See, it's a long, dramatic story, and you can read about it in 1 Samuel in the Old Testament of the Bible. But eventually, Saul died in battle, and when he did, David was finally made king of Israel. The wait was over. And David's path to the throne wasn't what he wanted or what he had planned. And during his more than 15 years waiting on God's promise to be fulfilled, 15 years, and I know that for some of you that's longer than you've even been alive, it's important to know that David never stopped talking to God. He constantly talked to God. He talked to God when he was lonely, when he was surrounded by enemies, when he was discouraged, when he was angry, when he was desperate. And this becoming a king at the end of scene 5 here, this isn't the end of David's story. In fact, even after he became king, we see that he's constantly talking to God. There are so many moments in David's life, even after this, where he cries out to God for help. Remember, I said that David was a talented musician. Well, throughout his life, David wrote plenty of songs for God. Many of David's songs can now be found in the biblical book of the Bible, Psalms. It's Psalms, Psalms. And these songs were prayers to God. They were often very raw and honest, and many of them were written about some of the moments in David's life where he really needed God's protection, where he was discouraged or in trouble, and he cries out to God in prayer through these psalms. Psalm 57 is one about David's close encounters with Saul when he was on the run for his life. And this is what he says in Psalm 57, 1-5. Have mercy on me, O God, have mercy. I look to you for protection. I will hide beneath the shadow of your wings until the danger passes by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who will fulfill his promise for me. He will send help from heaven to rescue me, disgracing those who hound me. My God will send forth his unfailing love and faithfulness. I am surrounded by fierce lions who greedily devour human prey, whose teeth are like spears and arrows, and whose tongues cut like swords. Be exalted, O God, above the highest heavens. May your glory shine over all the earth. Why did David cry out to God in these dark moments when he's on the run for his life and his life is in danger? Well, it's because David trusted that God was actually listening to him despite his terrifying circumstances. God heard David's cries when he was in the pit of despair. And God hears us when we're overcome by fear and anxiety and discouragement and doubt. Here's another song that David wrote about God hearing our prayers. It's Psalm 66. I'm going to read verses 16-20. It says, "Come and listen, all who fear God, and I will tell you what he did for me. For I cried out to him for help, praising him as I spoke. If I had not confessed the sins of my heart, the Lord would not have listened. But God did listen. He paid attention to my prayer. Praise God who did not ignore my prayer or withdraw his unfailing love from me." See, despite everything that David had experienced, he was certain that God heard his prayers. In response to the many times that God had listened to David's cries for help, David also wrote this psalm, Psalm 62, 1-6. I love the Lord because he hears my voice and my prayers for mercy. Because he bends down to listen, I will sing as long as I have breath. Death wrapped its ropes around me, and terrors of the grave overtook me. I saw only trouble and sorrow. Then I cried on the name of the Lord. Please, Lord, save me. How kind the Lord is. How good he is. So merciful, this God of ours. The Lord protects those of childlike faith. I was facing death, and he saved me. See, God made a promise that David would one day be king. And while David was waiting for that promise to be fulfilled, he fought a gigantic enemy, he dodged spears, he was hunted, he faced loneliness and terror and anger and despair and discouragement. But all along, he prayed, and God never stopped listening. While David waited for God to fulfill his promise of becoming king, he trusted God's faithfulness. While he waited, David never stopped talking to God because he knew that while we wait on God, God is listening.